That's right, ladies and gentlemen, from Tallahassee to Thomasville and from coast to the Queen City. How about that? It's Wake Up War Chant here on 97.9 ESPN Radio, and a very happy Thursday morning, the 13th, to you and yours. You're currently listening to the voice of Ryan Kelly, the director of digital media at warchant.com. There's no Glass today, there's no studio today, and there's no Drew Hicken today, but we got the next best thing, Mr. Ryan Clark, the lead beat writer of warchant.com, sitting next to us here in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Westin, getting ready for ACC Kickoff. Of course, as you probably guessed, we are recording this on Wednesday night just because of some of the moving pieces and travel and stuff like that, but we felt it was important to bring you a show today with all the big headlines and all the big stories coming. So, Ryan, it's good to have you aboard, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And, that's a long drive. It is one heck of a haul, but it is certainly great to be here. I love the city of Charlotte. This is one of my favorite, I guess, kind of road trips to go. And even though it hasn't been a road trip for the ACC Championship for the Noles in the last couple of years, it most certainly has been a nice trip here at Kickoff. This is a great venue to have this thing.
No, definitely. I mean, just kind of when you walk in through the door, you see the hotel employees wearing ACC shirts. You see the ACC banners. I mean, you do see a lot of media here, which is expected, but you have seen a couple fans. I think I saw, a Wake Forest and a Virginia Tech fan as we were in the lobby. So, I think people are definitely preparing for what's to come over the next few days.
Saw a couple Clemson fans as well. But, of course, thanks so much for waking up with us here at 6 a.m. on 97.9 or the streaming services. And today's show, just like every other show, is brought to you by our friends at For the Table, Madison Social, Central, and Township. And, of course, with all that being said, you know about our podcast. You probably have a service by now. If you've rated and subscribed to us, giving us a good review. We appreciate that. And, of course, to talk back to the show, radio@warchant.com is your place to do that. At Wake Up War Chant is your Twitter handle. Yesterday, before we got on the road and before we headed to Charlotte, when Drew and I last talked to you on Wednesday, we were kind of talking about the War Chant Roundtable, which is a great discussion that you guys did. It's a premium item on warchant.com right now. So if you want to see those official remarks, if you want to hear Ira's thoughts, if you want to hear Gene's thoughts, of course, you're about to get Ryan's thoughts on some of these things at the back end of that roundtable. You need to be a member. And free stuff, warchant30, that's your promo code to get in there. And I say all that to say this. The big headline, and we know what it's going to be. It's going to be Florida State's the team with the returning talent. Florida State's the team with the returning experience. Florida State's the team that is more than likely going to be the pick to win the Atlantic Coast Conference this weekend. I don't think that comes as a shock or a surprise to anyone, but Clemson's also the returning national champion. Clemson has won the last 2 ACC titles. They've won the last 2 games against Florida State, and they're really tough out at home. And we know that since 2011, correct? The winner of Florida State and Clemson has won the ACC. It's been one of those 2 squads. I mean, they've had some tough competition sometimes from out of the coastal. Of course, Georgia Tech has given both of those teams good games. Virginia Tech gave Clemson a good game last year. But we know who the 2 top dogs in this conference are. And it's really going to come down to that game in early November. I don't really think anybody doubts that. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But I'm certainly anxious to see how Florida State flips back to kind of its role of being the hunted, while Clemson kind of flips back to being that role of being the hunter, just in terms of those 2 teams, despite Clemson coming off a national championship.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how that process plays out, because I think when you're Florida State, you have been the weaker of the 2 teams as of late. But I also think that when you look at this group that is returning, you are talking about players like Derwin James and Tavares McFadden, and especially someone like McFadden, he's used to winning. And so I think you're going to see that swagger, but I also think too you're going to see it, at least one would think that it would be gradual, just because this time last year I don't think anyone was saying outright this team was going to win the ACC, but people thought it would be more of a competition. And as we saw, while this team was talented, it still had a lot of areas where it needed improvement. Whereas if with Clemson, I think it's easy for people to look at Clemson and go, that team's lost so much that they may not be as good as they were last year. But as you know and I know, first-year players in college football can be a difference maker. Now, you're asking for a lot of first-year players, whether they're incoming freshmen or guys who've sat, to do something. But then again, I look at someone like Mitch Trubisky last year at UNC, who, out of nowhere, he ends up having one of the best years of a quarterback in the ACC, really the nation. So
he becomes the number 2 pick in the NFL draft just from one season.
Yeah, and that's just it. Is you never know. So I think, yes, it'll come down to those 2 teams. And I think it will be a close game. I mean, it's been a close game. I think the last 4 of the last 5 seasons it's been close.
Yeah, I mean, 2013 in recent memory is the only one that you really kind of consider a blowout. I mean, 2012, Florida State ends up winning that game comfortably, but you get reminded that Clemson led that game at the half. I mean, it's been a competitive back-and-forth series since since Jimbo Fisher's gotten to Tallahassee. I mean, Dabo Swinney and Jimbo Fisher squads have traded barbs and traded jabs for going on. This will be year number 8 of the Jimbo Fisher era at Florida State, which, by the way, is still weird to say. But with all that being said, you do have to look at the hypotheticals because it's going to be one of the questions that's asked of both of these two squads. If Florida State wins at Clemson, I think we all assume that it probably means that regardless of what happens in that Alabama game, unless just a crazy toe-stub happens, Florida State is more than likely going to run the table through conference play. They're more than likely going to finish 11-1 or 12-0, and they're more than likely going to go to the ACC championship with a shot to make it to the college football playoff. To me, that's the simple scenario if Florida State wins this football game.
Yeah, it's simple, and I mean, at the same time, I think we also realize that if it's one thing this team has not done well the last few years, it's been the simple stuff. You're going to think about conference play, and there have been some close games. I think about, when you and I first jumped on this beat, and the last time they went to Wake, that was a closer game than people thought. I think everyone's kind of fascinated to see what happens with Louisville. Yes, we know that Louisville had, quite a few months, an entire summer to prepare for FSU, and that's no longer going to be the case, but people are interested to see. And I think Miami will be a close game, especially, it's going to be fascinating to see what life is like for them beyond Brad Kaya. So, yes, I think it's simple to say that this is a team that can go 12-0 or 11-1 and make its way to the ACC, but it's not to say that people are just going to lie down for them and whatnot, because, it's the same, I think, any year. Anytime you see that team that's good, everybody wants a shot. I look at Clemson, NC State last year.
Oh, and I agree with that as well. But I think Florida State, in terms of their schedule, it's paced very, very well. It's paced in that there really isn't that much of a trap game on the schedule, and that every big game seems to have breathing room, and everything that's kind of a trap comes off a place where you want to keep momentum going and you want to keep momentum building. I think you catch a huge break playing Miami week 3 with an inexperienced quarterback who's yet to play really any competition of note is the big deal there. Of course, the Alabama game is what it is. If you win, it's incredible. You kind of get yourself a out of jail free card. If you lose, no one's going to penalize you much for it. But
I don't know if I'd agree with the get out of jail free card, because it's like I said, and I'm sure everybody's kind of thought it. If FSU wins that game, and let's say they win by more than 14, they're screwed, because everyone will now expect for this team to win by 21 and win impressively against everyone.
But I think whenever you do that, whenever you beat a team like Alabama, especially if Alabama continues to win as that season goes throughout, I'll disagree with you a little bit there, just because I think any team can have a bad game. I look back to that Alabama team that got boat raced by Ole Miss a couple years back. People didn't expect Ole Miss to blow everybody out since then, but Alabama has worked up that reputation, and they've worked up that brand over the entire Nick Saban era that, if someone beats them, you get a little bit of a hat tip. If Bama loses a game they're not supposed to, on the inverse, Bama gets a little bit of a slide. And I feel like the inverse works for a team that beats them as well, at least in terms of the human element and the human eye. And, of course, that's what the big part of the college football playoff era has been. It's been about the eye test. It's been about human error, the human element. Now I sound like a baseball fan, but you get what I'm trying to say. It's very much about subjectivity, and I feel like you gain some favor in that category if you beat Alabama.
I think you gain favor if you beat Alabama, but I guess just for me, the concern I'm going to have with this team until proven otherwise is how do they handle winning, but more importantly, how do they handle losing? Because I think we saw last year after Louisville and UNC just how that group responded, and I think we saw a really good idea of what this team was from Clemson on. Like, yes, they lost a close game, but you still saw them go out and compete and win, and the things that were issues earlier in the year were no longer issues. And I think part of that just goes back to the fact of, again, what's the identity of this team going to be? What is it going to be like now that you don't have someone like Dalvin Cook who, while he could be quiet at times, what he did on the field kind of spoke volumes for guys to follow.
Leadership by example.
Yeah, you don't have a DeMarcus Walker who, it doesn't matter what position you play. If you're doing something is wrong, he's going to let you know about it. I mean, this group can certainly be vocal, but it's a different sort of vocal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and they're not without emotional leaders. Derwin James, an emotional guy. We saw plenty of emotion from DeAndre Francois on big moments in games last year. But this is a team that the leadership's going to have to shine through. You're absolutely right on that point. But I did want to flip to the inverse. If the leadership doesn't shine through, if the winds don't fall Florida State's way, regardless of what happens with the Alabama game, again, what happens if Clemson goes without a loss in the conference, or maybe stubs their toe, but has themselves a tiebreaker win over Florida State? What happens if Florida State goes to South Carolina with all this hype and with all this potential and all these expectations and loses to a Clemson team that I think a lot of people believe on paper, at least right now, like you said, some freshmen can surprise, some folks can do things like that and jump off the page that you don't expect. But right now, they're the favorite. I know Vegas at some point had Clemson as a favorite in that game just based off home field. It was within kind of that 4 to 5 point margin, but overall, Florida State on paper is the better team. And I think it raises a lot of questions, and I think you have a lot of unhappy fans if for whatever reason you don't get the job done up there.
I agree, because if Clemson is a team that comes in undefeated or with one loss and FSU loses that game, it's not an easy pill to swallow, but look, it's just that's a good team. But if Clemson has more than two or so losses and FSU loses, then it's certainly not a good look, and it's going to make you question things. And it's hard to say what to question because we don't know what's going to happen. But I think that's kind of probably how it would play out. But also, I think it would start to raise questions of, mentality and sense of a team. Because, 2015, I look at this team, and I think a lot of people gave it a free pass in the sense of it was a quote-unquote rebuilding team that needed to define itself in certain areas. 2016, it was really hard to foresee certain things happening. Like no one foresaw Derwin James getting hurt. No one foresaw things like loafing happen. No one foresaw kind of this mid-season sort of renaissance from guys like Auden Tate and Naquan Murray who stepped up. No one saw the injuries to where young guys like Carlos Becker all of a sudden were getting playing time. Whereas if this season, it's almost a little unfair to say, but I don't think the margin for error or the excuses are there because you've had enough injuries over the last 2 years to where guys are developed, so backups, at least defensively, should be able to come in. Now, offensively, yes, you've got a star quarterback, but that line's still going to be experienced. Those receivers, look, Tate and Murray have a combined 6 career starts. Beyond that, it's like you're taking question. There's a question.
And on top of that, the depth behind it just isn't there.
And that's what I was going to say is people were excited about what Keith Gavin did against Michigan, but Keith Gavin never had a reception last year.
Yeah.
George Campbell hasn't had a reception since 2015. Devontae Phillips, people are kind of wondering when will it work for him. And we don't know what young guys like DJ Matthews and Tamarian Terry are going to be. And then that's putting more pressure on the tight ends, which I think we've heard over the last few years are going to be more involved in the passing game.
And it just hasn't come to pass.
Granted, we saw a little bit more in the spring game, but even still, you just wonder how involved are they going to be. And so, yeah, unless it's a offensive miscue, but even then by that late in the year, unless FSU is just decimated by injuries, there's not going to be a lot of excuses for why that team can't win.
By that point, if you've defeated Louisville, if you've beaten Miami, and once again, I think I'd give the Miami W a little bit more than I would Louisville just because of the position on the schedule, because of mentions we've already talked about here. But if you are, say you have one loss or no losses rolling into that Clemson game, of course that one loss would, fingers crossed, if you're a Florida State fan, be Alabama. If that's the road you got to take, you've got to be ready to go. That offensive line has to be ready to play. Those wide receivers have to be experienced, and they have to be there at all times of the game. You can't have guys disappear like Florida State's had with wide receivers over the last couple of years. You can't have guys be allergic to the end zone the way certain wide receivers have been over the last couple of years at FSU. Those guys have to be legitimate threats. running back situation has to come along. You've got to have guys that can help Jock Patrick and maybe even surpass Jock Patrick if a couple guys live up to their potential maybe sooner than you think. If you can get that going. You're right. There is really no excuse this time around. The injuries may have been a factor last year, but that's a great point that you brought up. These backups should be well enough experienced.
At least defensively.
Offensively, yes.
Offensively, I think, is the big question with this team because, I mean, you could apply this to any team. What happens if your starting quarterback gets hurt? But in the case of FSU, I mean, how comfortable do you feel with J.J. Cosentino, or do you take a chance with someone like a Bailey Hockman or James Blackman? Running back, I mean, if Jaquez gets hurt, look, you've got plenty of options. So, okay, whatever. But offensive line's a little bit different in receiver. I mean, again, you're taking a gamble if guys like Murray and Tate get hurt because then you're hoping someone like George Campbell steps up, which, while talented, he is coming off of an injury. And we've said it with Gavin and Phillips what the concern could be there. So, I mean, I think with the offense there's questions. But by the time they get to Clemson, if they haven't had a lot of injuries and it appears they've gained cohesion, then I think the excuses are minimal. But as far as that defense is concerned, I can't really think of anything because even if you get hurt on a defensive line, you've got 5 stars ready to come in. If you get hurt at linebacker, you've got 4 stars ready to come in, experienced 4 stars. That secondary, all those guys have played. They should be ready in case of anything happens. I mean, you wonder about who's going to replace Marquez White, but even then, whoever their understudy is has had experience either from last year or by that point in the Clemson game, you'd think they'd have experience just from getting in nickel situations or even mop-up duty.
And on top of all that, man, you look at this thing as a complete package. You look at this thing as a whole. That defense all throughout. If it doesn't come to pass for that defense, you got to start asking those questions that I think people were asking midseason last year. You got to start asking about where does the motivation come from? What's going on at the top? And again, I don't like to stir that pot at ACC Kickoff, but while we're on the conversation, it's something that if hypothetically that's an issue at that point in the season, you start asking questions and you start raising eyebrows.
You kind of have to because, I mean, we were talking about it on the write-up. When you think about this defense, and to kind of look ahead to 2018, I mean, we all kind of made the comment of this defense is going to be bare because of the experience you have. I mean, Sweat's a junior, Noddy's a senior, Christmas is redshirt junior, I believe, redshirt junior, redshirt senior.
I want to say junior, but don't quote me on that.
But the point is you have Thomas, who's a redshirt senior. You have Hoskins, who's a redshirt junior, redshirt senior. You've got upperclassmen as well as McFadden's a junior. James, I mean, yes, he's a redshirt sophomore, but in all reality, he's a junior.
Yeah.
Trey Marshall's been there for going on, his 4th year. Erman Lane, I know last year he made that transition, but he is still a senior. And, I mean, to go, really deep, I mean, you do have Nate Andrews who's coming back.
I was going to say, I feel like Nate Andrews has been at Florida State longer than Jimbo Fisher has.
But the point is just that's your experience. And don't forget a guy like Jacob Pugh who had a great spring. I mean, he's also experienced. And so when you have that many experienced players, not saying that they're not going to be mistakes because, I mean, they're still 21, 22, 23-year-olds. But the mistakes they made last year shouldn't be mistakes for this coming season.
Depth is most certainly one thing for Florida State. Delivering is another. And I think that's a question that might get brought up a couple times at ACC Kickoff, and that, the pressure is firmly on Florida State, where it hasn't been the last couple of years. This is the first time that a lot of these guys who are now upperclassmen are getting a taste of, you are unequivocally the top dog. You are unequivocally the hunted. You are the ones who are expected to go out and take care of this thing. A good group of people thought you could last year, and now everybody does. How do you react to that? We got a really good show coming up for you. We got some more to chat right on the other end. It's Wake Up War Chant on 97.9 ESPN Radio. Welcome back to Wake Up War Chant on 97.9 ESPN Radio Roadshow, coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. Ryan Kelly and Ryan Clark coming here with you. Of course, brought to you by our friends at For the Table, Madison Social Township, and our friends at Central. Doesn't get much better than pizza and beer, folks. Right next door to Madison Social, you can get yourself a half-price pitcher when you order any of their 8 brick oven square pies. And I will say this, that pizza's good. I don't know if you've ever had it, if you're listening to me, but if you're under the sound of my voice, you need to try that. And if you order any of those, you get a pitcher of beer at the half price. That's 6 beers to choose from, including Browning Proof Mango Wit, of course, local, good stuff. If you're guaranteed to find the perfect beer to go with your pizza, make sure you're there right next door to Madison Social, 815 West Madison Street. Make sure you're headed that way. Of course, ACC Kickoff, why we're here. It's the name of the game, and lots of, I guess you could say, storylines as a whole for the Atlantic Coast Conference. We're not expecting any big announcements tomorrow, so I don't think it's going to be quite the hullabaloo it was last year when the ACC Network got announced and all that. I'm sure John Swafford will field some questions, and I'm sure that'll be a point of discussion for tomorrow. But I think the ACC, especially coming off a season that was as superb as it was, you mentioned it. Mitch Trubisky played for 1 year. He was the second pick in the NFL draft. You won the national championship with a really, really, really good Clemson team that upsets the Alabama Crimson Tide, who under Nick Saban had never lost in a game like that. You had a lot of good things happen for you. Florida State beats that up-and-coming Michigan team that a lot of folks loved and a lot of folks thought was maybe national title worthy. A lot of good things happened for you, but now I feel like you've got a lot of question marks if you're in the ACC. You went from being...
Oh, don't forget, you had the Heisman Trophy winner.
And, of course, yeah, Lamar Jackson, who... if I've read our schedule correctly, we are supposed to be talking to today. So make sure to look for that interview coming here in the next couple days. Thanks for the plug. I like it. But getting back to the topic at hand, though, Ryan, you've lost a lot of talented people. Deshaun Watson, Mitch Trubisky, a lot of folks on that Clemson defense. There's a lot of question marks about this league that maybe there weren't a year ago. And I think that's part of why the ACC was so successful, was because it was very talented. It was very, I don't want to say old, I guess experienced would be the right word. And you had a lot of stability at quarterback. And I feel like you look right now, outside of DeAndre Francois and Lamar Jackson, you don't have a lot of that right now in the ACC. And Eric Dungey. I'll throw Eric Dungey in that mix as well.
You don't, but I think here's what you do have if you're the ACC. The first is you have another built-in year of a rivalry game that everyone's going to watch in FSU and Clemson. The second thing that you've got is what will Lamar Jackson do in year 2? And can Louisville take the next step? Because before that late season tumble, there were some people wondering, is Louisville potentially an outside favorite of maybe winning the ACC and perhaps going to the playoff? You also have what Sports Illustrated deems as the number 1 player in Derwin James. There's going to be the interest of what Florida State does. There's going to be the interest of what Clemson does. But also, people are going to be, I think, interested to see what goes on in other programs. Like, people are wondering what Mark Richt and Miami are going to do. People are wondering what's going to be the outlook at the Virginia schools. I mean, it's probably not the note the ACC wants, but you kind of wonder what's the shelf life of someone like Paul Johnson at Georgia Tech, because you think another poor year, especially when you look at this conference and you see that, okay, here's what Florida State and Clemson has. Here's who Miami got. Here's who the Virginia schools got. Syracuse has someone in Dino Babers. You're seeing other schools get competitive, and if you're Georgia Tech, you just kind of wonder, if you have another poor season, is it worth kind of changing the script?
And you have a new athletic director who's already shown that when he can get his own guy in there and roll the dice like he did in basketball, bring in Brian Pastor, it worked out well.
Josh Pastor.
Yeah,
from Memphis. But the thing is like these are all things that are certainly worth keeping an eye on. And I mean, look, I think that's always the funny part about college football this time of the year is everybody has storylines, but 3 months from now, those storylines could certainly change. There could be a team that comes out of nowhere. There could be a player that comes out of nowhere. There could be a favorite team that hits the skids for whatever reason. There could be a team that no one saw doing anything that all of a sudden, maybe possibly wins 8-9 games. I mean, I think that's kind of the beauty of July and August is it's all the idea of like what could be versus what actually happens.
It's amazing to me, a couple of the storylines that have stayed consistent in the ACC over the last couple of years. I could pretty much give you my ACC Atlantic ballot right now. It's probably going to be Florida State, Clemson, then it's going to be Louisville, then it'll probably be Syracuse just because of Dungey, just above Wake Forest, and there's your top 5 right there. I couldn't even think or fathom, and we've got to do ballots this week for preseason picks. I haven't even wrapped my brain around what the top 5 in the Coastal is going to look like. And that, to me, is as interesting a storyline as ever, despite here we are, what seems like a decade later, you still don't know what to expect out of it.
No, and I think in some ways that can be a good thing because I think we look at other conferences and they can get predictable. I mean, I think the joke about the Big 12, for the longest time was it's Oklahoma, Texas, and friends. With the Pac-12, same thing applied to Oregon for a little bit.
And then later Oklahoma State and friends.
Right, but whereas if now, you look at someone like the Pac-12, there's interest in what USC will do, what Washington will do, what will Oregon be with a new coach. And and I think that's just kind of it with college football at the moment is I think it's fascinating, and I think you kind of need these storylines because while you would like to have an idea of what could come out of two divisions of a conference, you would like to know if there's some mystery, and I think that's the one thing the Coastal's been good at. The consistency's been inconsistent. And no one really – I don't even know who you would consider to be the dominant power of the Coastal. I don't know if such thing exists. Whereas if you look at the other side of the ACC, it's FSU, it's Clemson, and then I would say a drop or two down would be Louisville. But beyond that, who knows?
And, I will say this about my Atlantic standings. I did kind of forget NC State, who, even though we've discussed this on air before, I'm not the biggest Dave Dorn guy. You do have to give them credit that they surged at the end of last season, ended up beating North Carolina. And, you mentioned dominant power.
They had Clemson on the ropes.
Yeah, and you mentioned they had Florida State on the ropes.
Yeah.
You mentioned dominant power in the Coastal. I think until North Carolina kind of had their fall off in the late couple weeks of last season, they were all set to lock up their second Coastal championship. They were all set to kind of maybe have a little bit of consistency. But it just seems like every time someone's about to take the reins of that division, they just can't. Georgia Tech, if you want to make me look really stupid, why don't you go back to our early days of doing War Chant Radio and some of my predictions for Georgia Tech in the 2015 season. Now, granted, they were coming off of a
really good Orange Bowl.
They were coming off a really good Orange Bowl. There were a lot of high expectations. Granted, they had a ton of injuries, but they still did not win a lot of football games. They still didn't make a bowl. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. But no one really seems to have stepped up and taken that prize. With North Carolina in a rebuild year, with Virginia Tech looking for answers at quarterback, it's going to be a long rebuilding process for Bronco Mendenhall at Virginia. This just screams to be the year of, hey, Miami, you've got a really good coach. If you're not going to do it now, I get you're breaking in a new quarterback, but you're going to have a decent defense. You're going to have a disgusting linebacker core. If you don't do it now, when are you going to do it?
Well, and not only – I know people talk about N'Kosi Perry, their young quarterback, and kind of what to expect. And not that I am trying to set him up for anything of the sort, but I think it's fair to keep in mind that in this conference, look at the amount of first-year starters who've done well. DeAndre Francois did really, really well. We've seen guys like Mitch Trubisky, who went on to be the number 2 pick. But we've also seen guys like, yes, Lamar Jackson had experience, but last year was his first full year of playing. Deshaun Watson 2 years ago was his first full year of playing. And that's it, is I think that there are quarterbacks that if you have the right infrastructure around them, they can do well. This was a question people were asking of DeAndre Francois last year.
That's fair.
Hey, this was a team that has a star running back in Dalvin Cook, venerable receivers in Whitfield, Wilson, and Rudolph. And while the line needs some work, at least there's some experienced pieces to work with. Will this be able to work? Oh, and you also have a good supporting cast in tight ends and fullbacks as well. But, can this work with someone like Francois? And it obviously did. And now we look at him and say, okay, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the nation, let alone the ACC. So I think with N'Kosi Perry, again, only time will tell. But this is a league that's shown that incoming first-year quarterbacks, whether you're a true freshman or someone who sat a year, you can have success in this league, but it is really based around the infrastructure in place.
If you had to pick the Coastal right now, you have that ballot in front of your face. Who you putting it first?
Miami.
I'm with you. And I think one of the things that helps Miami, they're not playing a conference game the week after FSU. They get themselves a nice little breather because we've seen it. And I think we both kind of expect right now, because of Miami's inexperience at that point, because of Perry's inexperience at that point, they're probably going to lose that game in Tallahassee. And that's not trying to put the homer hat on. That's just, you look at the realizations and the circumstances of both of those teams, and you think to yourself, yeah, that's a game Florida State's more than likely going to win. With that being said, the fact that there isn't a Virginia Tech or a Georgia Tech or an NC State or somebody the next week for the bottom to fall out, and the confidence to just kind of hit zero the way it has the last couple seasons for Miami, I honestly do think that is a big deal.
I think it's a huge deal, but I also look at it from FSU's perspective of, if you lose against Alabama, you're going to want to rip the head off of everybody you play from there on out.
Especially Miami.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not that you really need motivation for an FSU-Miami game, but that would be another, I guess, kindle in the fire. Whereas if you're FSU and you go out and beat Alabama, whether it's by 1 point or 14 or more, there's going to be the sort of confidence there that you want to guard against being too confident, but at the same time, you'd be 2-0. You'd be playing Miami at home. It's a series you've won, and you know Miami's going to try to come in looking for an upset. So, I mean, I think FSU has the edge in a sense of a psychological battle because, I mean, it's a series that they've won, but the other thing, too, is you're either going to be really angry losing to Alabama and motivated, which we saw what happened when this team got, embarrassed in a sense and got motivated in the second half of the season, or they're going to build off of their confidence and go, okay, the last three, aside from, of course, the week 2 game, if you're this team, you look at your last 3 wins and you go, it's Alabama, it's Michigan, which a lot of people think have a shot at, doing something this year, and Florida, which, I mean, say what you want about Florida.
That defense was still that defense.
But that defense was still good. It was still a top 25 team. I mean, yes, they got shellacked in their conference game, but the point is that defense was still one of the better ones in America. And
you made it look foolish in the second half of the football game.
And that is something that going forward you can say you are 3-0 in your last 3 games against top 25 teams. It's a good thing to build from.
Yeah, there's a lot of storylines around the ACC, and I'm really anxious to see what John Swafford has to say. I'm anxious to see what the Atlantic coaches have to say today. We got more on the other end. It's Wake Up War Chant on 97.9 ESPN Radio.
Dragging my feet, I feel like everybody's watching me cut my teeth.
Yes, Florida State just landed a 5-star commitment.
I don't see that anywhere online. How did you get that news so fast?
I'm on the new warchant.com app. I get news updates and scores pushed to my phone instantly.
How much does it cost?
It's free. Just go to iTunes or the Google Play Store, type in Warchant, and install it on your phone. That's it.
A free app that keeps me constantly up to date on Florida State sports and recruiting? Wow, that makes it incredibly easy to follow my Seminoles and never miss out.
With the app, you'll also get quick access to all the stories and features on Warchant, including the ever-popular message boards that feature thousands of fans talking about the Noles.
Warchant.com, your ultimate Seminole source.
Welcome back to Wake Up War Chant, brought to you by For the Table, Madison Social, Central, and Township. Of course, in College Town in Tallahassee. Ryan Kelly and Ryan Clark here with you on a pre-ACC kickoff edition of WUW. Did want to talk about a lot of guys getting watch list love, and did want to just kind of give some recognition to those folks. It's Derwin James, Matthew Thomas, Derek Noddy, Tavares McFadden. They all make it to the Bednarik Award watch list. DeAndre Francois makes it to the Maxwell Award watch list. Ricky Aguayo makes it onto the Lou Groza Award watch list. Eberle and Izzo both make it to watch lists as well. Of course, Alec Eberle making his way over to the Remington Trophy watch list, and Ryan Izzo making his way to the Mackey Award watch list. It's a lot of guys. I get that these watch lists are sometimes overcrowded, and it's basically, the Groza watch list is basically half the kickers in D1. I understand that, but the fact that you're getting a lot of guys who are getting a lot of recognition, it's a nice thing if you're Florida State, and it's good to see all these guys get rewarded, and it's good to see that a lot of folks seem to think that you're going to have a really talented ball club.
I think that's kind of the expectation, but, I think that's always the thing about watch lists that are a little dangerous, and we've all agreed is, you look at it now and it's like, okay, do you play this position? Do you meet the criteria? Hey, welcome to the watch list.
And it's like you said last segment, 3 months later, everything can be completely different.
Oh, exactly. Because, I'm sure, last year, I don't want to say this because I'm sure someone will find it, but I'm sure when you're looking at, the quarterback watch list for all the different awards, I'm sure people just had Mitch Trubisky penciled right in. Now, I'm sure someone somewhere probably did because, hey, you never know. But, that's just it. It's really hard, I think, to predict and figure out. But I think if you're FSU, you've got to like it because, look, there are guys that I think everybody expects to be in for some major hardware. Last I saw, DeAndre Francois was an 18-1 favorite to win the Heisman Trophy, according to Bovada. I think it's a very good possibility Derwin James walks away with some hardware. Matthew Thomas is going to be interesting because I think he's always been that guy that everybody says, if he can put it together, watch out. And I think last year, toward the end, we saw that.
This is a huge year for him, and that if he can consistently put it together, at the end of the year, he's going to have made himself a lot of money. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Because, I think that the biggest thing for him is he was actually able to get a year to where he could play, he could develop, and he's got, that experience under his belt that's been consistent. And I think he goes into this year knowing it's his last year and what's at stake. It's going to be pretty interesting to see how he does.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to see how some of these guys on this list deliver. Little surprised that Alec Eberle ended up on that list, and that's nothing against Alec Eberle. He's a great dude, but he struggled last season. There's no doubt about it.
Well,
I think obviously injuries had another part to do with it, like they had to do with most of the 2016 season. But let's face it, there were times at last season where he just wasn't good.
That, and I think the difference between Eberle and everybody else on that list is everybody else on that list is going to have their job, and we know they're going to have a job. With Eberle, he's going to go into preseason camp with probably the most fascinating position battle, which I know center does not sound the most glamorous thing.
It's not sexy.
But at the same time,
it's hugely important.
It is because, you don't know if it's going to be him. You don't know if it's going to be Bavian Johnson. You don't know if it's going to be Andrew Baselli. And I think this is going to be on the Wake Up War Chant bingo card if such a thing exists. But I can't stress this enough. If you play Eberle, you have a lineman with 2 years of starting experience. If you don't play him, your most experienced lineman will presumably be sophomore Landon Dickerson, once again, who is younger than Google, has 7 career starts, and he is your most experienced O-lineman. And so, yes, what goes on at center is going to be incredibly important from here on out. But of all those guys on that watch list, we don't know if Eberle's going to start against Alabama. Everybody else, we know they're going to start, and we know they're going to get significant play time. But with Alec Eberle, I hate to put this much pressure on a guy, but I think if there's anyone who needs to have a phenomenal preseason camp, it is Alec Eberle. It really is.
It's a heck of a thing to ask an interior line, regardless of which one of those three that we really think have a shot at the job starts, and that Andrew Baselli and Bavion Johnson would be, in their young careers, making a start at the first game right out of the gate against the Alabama Crimson Tide. Or you go with Alec Eberle, the guy who's experienced, the guy who's been there, the guy who's been the center in a lot of big games. He's there coming off of hip surgery against the Alabama Crimson Tide. That's a tall order for anybody, no matter which way you slice it.
Well, it is, and and that's where you have to kind of weigh, is it experience versus, what you might think is more athleticism. And watching this thing play out as we get, closer and closer to that game against Florida State and Alabama, it is something to keep an eye on. And I know it's a thing for us to transition to go from the watch list to now all of a sudden previewing, but look, it's fair, and I think that's the thing about watch lists is when you think about these players, you think, yes, a lot of them are guys who, you can have a solid idea of what you think the year will be, but with Alec Eberle, Alec Eberle and what happens at center is one of the biggest mysteries this team will face in preseason.
I wanted to ask you, because Drew and I had a little bit of this conversation yesterday. You mentioned you think Derwin James is a guy who can come home with some hardware at the end of the year. He's on a lot of Heisman odds lists. What would it take for a defensive player to win the Heisman in 2017? Not even specifically Derwin James, because let's face it, the Heisman over the last 5, 6, 7 years,
it's a quarterback award,
with a few notable exceptions, of course, it's been an offensive award for far longer than that. But I was just even going to mention over the last decade or so, the Heisman has been an award that's been given out to a lot of people that came on that none of us expected, that were surprises. Johnny Manziel, when he won in 2012, was a surprise. Lamar Jackson was not exactly a guy who was mentioned for the stiff arm at the beginning of last season. Jameis Winston, a lot of people thought he'd be good. People didn't think that a redshirt freshman was going to win the Heisman. It's been a lot of surprises. So I don't think predicting the Heisman's the smartest business in this world. But what do you think it takes in 2017 for a guy to even get seriously considered? Not just the invite because he got a lot of third-place votes, but seriously considered on the defensive side of the football for the Heisman Trophy.
A couple things. I think it takes having outrageous stats, and what that would be, it depends on the position. I think if you're a defensive back, realistically, you'd have to have more than 10 interceptions. And of those 10, I think you'd have to return 5 for touchdowns. I'd also think you'd have to be the sort of player that, when you make tackles and interceptions, they have to be in these big, game-altering moments. I think the other thing, too, is let's say if you're a defensive lineman, if you're an end, I think at this point you've got to put up 18, 19 sacks. I think you really, truly do. I think if you're a linebacker, you've got to get over 130 tackles. But again, it has to be interceptions in these game-changing things. And I don't even know if you could say if playing offense or being on special teams is enough, because I think we look at Charles Woodson and say that certainly helped him do it in that year where he beat out Peyton Manning, Ryan Leaf, Randy Moss, which, talk about a heck of a year. But I think that's what it takes, but I also think the most important thing it takes, too, is you have to be the player that everybody is talking about. Because, look, the thing that helped Lamar Jackson's Heisman candidacy was he absolutely came out in the first 2 games, put up some incredible numbers. He leaped over that kid at Syracuse.
And despite the loss, hung right there with Clemson and almost single-handedly won that
game. But what I was going to say is, but before we even get to Clemson, there was already buzz about him in 2 games against teams that you knew they were going to beat. But once he had that game against FSU, then people really started to look out. And I think that's what it takes now, is constantly being in the conversation and being on people's minds.
Derwin's certainly got the eyeballs now. Let's see if he can keep them. We're putting a bow on it right after this. Wake Up War Chant, 97.9 ESPN Radio. Real short time to put a bow on it here on Wake Up War Chant 97.9 ESPN Radio. Ryan Kelly and Ryan Clark here with you in Charlotte, North Carolina. Really quick question. Better sports takedown yesterday? Peyton Manning taking down Kevin Durant at the ESPYs, or Conor McGregor saying that Floyd Mayweather can't read?
I would say McGregor, because Peyton Manning. I think people know Peyton Manning's funny if you saw the Rob Lowe roast, but always making fun of Floyd, especially a guy who invites it, is bad. But to make fun of him, especially with the tax stuff and that's going on, and the fact he allegedly can't read, that's bad. Man, the promos that Conor McGregor has cut over the last 3 days are better than anything that's come out of pro wrestling in the last 10 years. I agree with that.
He is phenomenal. The way that he just seems to have it's part roast, it's part wrestling promo, it's part stand-up special. It's quite honestly a joy to watch. Ryan, thank you, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to you guys for listening. Mike and Mike's up next, 97.9 ESPN Radio.
WarChant.com is the ultimate inside source for FSU football and recruiting. And now you can get in on the action for free for an entire month. WarChant.com is offering a risk-free 30-day trial subscription. Get full access to the #1 website covering the Seminoles just by entering the promo code WarChant30. That's WarChant30. Sign up and get in on the world's most active FSU message boards. Receive breaking news, stories from our award-winning staff, plus get exclusive interviews and videos. Just enter the promo code WarChant30. WarChant.com, your ultimate Seminole sports source.
Hey, thanks for downloading today's show. If you haven't already, why don't you rate and subscribe us? We certainly do appreciate it, and of course, we appreciate you listening anyway, so just go ahead and click that right there. You know you want to. Come on. Come on. Thanks again for letting us do the show. We love giving you all the football, basketball, baseball, recruiting, all year round. Not just football season, not just spring practice, but hopefully giving you the freshest and newest FSU content every day.
Thanks, guys.